A thick fog clung to London in the winter of 1936, muffling the sounds of a city uneasy yet unaware of how close it stood to an international rupture. Inside Whitehall, Winston Churchill, still a political outsider, sat alone at his desk, surrounded by drafts, intelligence summaries, and maps of a rearming Germany. The air carried the faint burn of cigarette smoke as he dipped his pen into ink and began writing a letter he believed Europe was not yet ready to read. It was a warning born from years of study, frustration, and a growing fear that England's leaders were sleepwalking into catastrophe. Churchill's letter was not addressed to Parliament or to the British public. Instead, it was meant for a select circle of senior European statesmen, many of whom were still clinging to illusions of peace. He wanted them to confront the evidence, documented German violations of the Treaty of Versailles, clandestine airfields, escalating armament programs, and Hitler's expanding territorial ambitions. The letter did not merely caution. It predicted a chain reaction of aggression that could engulf the continent if decisive action was not taken. Its tone was urgent, forceful, and uncomfortably direct. The risk was enormous. Churchill held no official government post. To many inside the cabinet, he was still the relic of an earlier political age, brilliant, yes, but reckless, overly dramatic, and dangerously obsessed with the idea of German rearmament. If the letter were leaked or misinterpreted, it could be seen as unofficial diplomacy, even as an attempt to influence foreign governments behind the back of His Majesty's government. It could strain relations with France, anger appeasers in London, or provoke diplomatic retaliation from Hitler himself. But Churchill believed the truth was worth the gamble. Years of intelligence briefings, delivered quietly by sympathetic civil servants and RAF officers, had shaped his understanding of Germany's secret buildup. Production figures buried in export data, Luftwaffe expansion hidden under civilian aviation budgets, and reports from German émigrés fleeing political persecution all pointed toward the same reality. Hitler was preparing to shatter Europe's balance of power. Churchill felt morally compelled to intervene, even without the backing of Downing Street. Across the Channel, the situation was already deteriorating. The French government was struggling with political instability, economic strain, and internal conflict between its left and right wings. In Eastern Europe, smaller nations feared German intimidation but lacked the strength to oppose it. Churchill's private message was designed to help these nations grasp the scale of the threat and pressure Britain to abandon its wishful thinking. He reminded them that Hitler's strategy relied on speed, shock, and diplomatic paralysis. Without unity, without early action, Europe would face disaster. The draft letter also contained an astonishing prediction. Hitler would soon remilitarize the Rhineland, an act that would break the Treaty of Versailles and test whether the Western powers had the will to enforce international law. Churchill argued that if Germany was allowed to fortify the region unopposed, it would irrevocably shift the military balance, embolden Hitler, and signal to the world that treaties held no meaning. His warning was chillingly precise, almost prophetic. Churchill's closest confidants begged him to reconsider. Some feared the letter would appear as though he were trying to undermine Britain's elected government. Others worried it could be dismissed as sensationalism and close foreign leaders' ears to future warnings. But Churchill, accustomed to ridicule and resistance, pushed ahead. His aim was not political gain, but continental awareness, a desperate attempt to jolt Europe awake before it was too late. Sealing the envelope, Churchill knew the document in his hands was dynamite. If its contents became public, it could isolate him further, damage Britain's diplomatic standing, and spark political turmoil at home. Yet he believed history demanded candor. As he handed the letter to a trusted courier under strict instructions for secrecy, Churchill understood the gravity of what he had set in motion. A private warning, unofficial, unsanctioned, and brutally honest, was now on its way across Europe, carrying the potential to ignite a crisis the world was not prepared to face. The courier who carried Churchill's letter departed London quietly, slipping through Victoria Station under cover of the morning rush. Trains hissed, whistles shrieked, and travelers pressed forward unaware that among them moved a message capable of unsettling the fragile political balance of Europe. The envelope was tucked discreetly beneath layers of official correspondence, protected by diplomatic protocols, but unknown to the very government it might one day embarrass. Each mile the train covered carried Churchill's warning closer to capitals still divided over how to interpret Germany's ambitions. As the letter crossed the Channel, the political atmosphere in Europe was shifting with electric tension. France, its government fractured by ideological battles, was still reeling from economic turmoil and rising extremism on both the left and right. Churchill's message, addressed to select French officials, urged them to recognize the approaching storm and challenge their own government's tendency toward hesitation. His words painted a dire picture of German movements near the Rhineland, hinting that Hitler was preparing a bold territorial test that could alter the continent's strategic foundations overnight. In Paris, senior ministers received the letter with mixed emotions. Some had privately suspected that Germany's military expansion was more advanced than publicly acknowledged, and Churchill's detailed intelligence citations substantiated their worst fears. But others saw the communication as an intrusion, an unofficial British intervention that risked inflaming an already delicate situation. The fact that the message had come from a figure not currently in the British cabinet made its implications even more difficult to navigate. To acknowledge it publicly would invite diplomatic confrontation. To ignore it would mean discarding perhaps the clearest warning yet delivered. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Reich was accelerating its preparations, entirely unaware of the private exchanges swirling in foreign ministries. German engineers were working at a frantic pace, constructing new airfields disguised as civilian aviation sites, while Wehrmacht planners refined their intentions for the Rhineland. Hitler understood the psychological impact of a bold move and believed that if France and Britain failed to respond militarily, he would gain not only a strategic advantage but immense political legitimacy at home. Churchill's letter, if acted upon, threatened to disrupt that calculation before it could unfold. Within the French Foreign Ministry, arguments erupted behind closed doors. Some officials believed Churchill's intelligence was credible, and that France, still bound by treaty obligations to enforce demilitarization of the Rhineland, must prepare an immediate military response if Germany made its move. But others feared the consequences. Mobilization would rattle the French public, strain the economy, and risk igniting a war no one felt ready to fight. The letter sharpened this divide, intensifying debates that had simmered for months. As the document circulated discreetly among trusted policymakers, Churchill's warnings began to resonate beyond France. Copies made their way to the Belgian and Dutch governments, whose leaders were increasingly concerned about neutrality in a landscape dominated by German intimidation. For them, the letter revealed a chilling truth. The buffer zones they relied on for protection were under threat, and their defense strategies, built on assumptions of slow, predictable escalation, were now dangerously obsolete. But the letter also raised alarms in London. Some of Churchill's political rivals caught wind of an unofficial communication circulating among European governments and suspected that he was attempting to conduct his own shadow diplomacy. Rumors filtered through Whitehall that Churchill was stirring panic abroad and undermining the British government's official policy of conciliation. The possibility that his correspondence might reach the press or be used by foreign leaders to pressure Britain added urgency to efforts to keep the entire episode contained. As the letter's influence spread quietly from one capital to another, it became clear that Churchill had not merely delivered a warning. He had injected a volatile truth into the bloodstream of European diplomacy. Some welcomed it as a desperately needed jolt of realism. Others saw it as a dangerous provocation. But all who read it sensed the same unsettling possibility. If the old world did not act swiftly, it might soon face the most decisive turning point since the Great War. In London, the news that Churchill's private letter was quietly circulating across Europe sent tremors through the British political establishment. Though still out of the cabinet, he was being watched with increasing suspicion and even resentment by those who believed the fragile peace depended on restraint rather than provocation. Senior officials feared that foreign governments might interpret Churchill's warning as representing Britain's true intentions, undermining the official line of appeasement. The possibility that one man, operating independently, could tug at the threads of European diplomacy posed a threat to the government's carefully maintained facade of stability. Inside the Cabinet Office, documents were retrieved, speeches examined, and foreign communications scrutinized as ministers sought to determine the full extent of Churchill's activities. His letter had not breached any law. It did not reveal classified information. It carried no direct instructions or commitments. And yet, the intensity of its phrasing, the blunt articulation of Germany's rising military power, the urgency of mobilization, the insistence that the Rhineland was the fulcrum upon which peace rested, made it politically dangerous. If it surfaced publicly, it could suggest to foreign powers that Britain was more aware of Hitler's ambitions than it admitted, and worse, that it was doing nothing to stop them. Meanwhile, in Paris, the letter had become fuel for a bitter political divide. French military commanders, already anxious about the state of their forces, seized upon Churchill's intelligence as validation for calls to strengthen border defenses and revise outdated mobilization plans. The Maginot Line, though imposing, was never meant to operate without coordinated diplomatic resistance to German expansion. Churchill's prediction that Hitler would remilitarize the Rhineland placed the French leadership in a perilous position. React too slowly, and Germany would seize the initiative. React too strongly, and France might trigger a war it was politically unprepared to fight. Yet among France's political leadership, fear of domestic upheaval overshadowed strategic necessity. The French economy was still struggling, and public confidence in government institutions was brittle. Mobilization, even partial, risked massive protests, strikes, and political backlash. Many officials viewed Churchill's letter not as a lifeline, but as an unwelcome complication, reminding them of obligations that were becoming harder to enforce. As the letter was quietly debated in closed sessions, divisions hardened, making unified action increasingly unlikely. The smaller nations of Western Europe responded differently. Belgium, sensing that Churchill's warning implied that neutrality might no longer protect it, began covertly discussing updates to its defense strategy. Diplomats whispered about the possibility of German pressure on the Low Countries should France falter or hesitate. Churchill's depiction of Hitler's ambitions suggested that the buffer states of Europe were not obstacles but stepping stones. This realization unsettled governments accustomed to diplomatic maneuvering rather than rapid military transformations. Back in Britain, Churchill waited anxiously for any sign that his warning had gained traction. He received discreet updates from sympathetic figures within foreign ministries, suggesting that some leaders had taken his caution seriously, but none appeared ready to act decisively. Years of wishful thinking had lulled Europe into believing that Hitler could be restrained through treaties, conferences, and mutual assurances. The belief that the trauma of the First World War had permanently cured the continent of military confrontation acted as a soothing illusion, blinding officials to the reality Churchill saw so clearly in German production figures and political ideology. What made the letter so dangerous was not merely its predictions, but its implication. If Europe failed to confront Hitler early, the cost of stopping him later would be exponentially higher. Churchill's phrasing underscored this point relentlessly, an argument few were prepared to face. By warning that Germany could soon achieve strategic superiority, he challenged the comforting narratives upon which European diplomacy had depended for 2 decades. For many leaders, acknowledging the truth meant admitting their nations had squandered the interwar years. And then, almost precisely as Churchill had foreseen, Hitler made his move. Plans were finalized in Berlin for the remilitarization of the Rhineland, a bold gamble designed to test the resolve of France and Britain. The German dictator believed that neither power would act, that their fear of triggering war outweighed their desire to enforce a treaty. As German troops prepared to cross the Rhine in open defiance of Versailles, Churchill's letter, dismissed by some, feared by others, suddenly seemed less like an alarmist document and more like a prophecy. The fuse he had identified months earlier was now burning toward a crucial detonation. At dawn on March 7, 1936, German soldiers marched into the Rhineland in open violation of the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact, exactly as Churchill had warned. The operation was bold, calculated, and perilously fragile. Hitler knew that even a limited French military response would force his lightly armed battalions to retreat in humiliation. What he gambled on was not military superiority, but political paralysis, and he was right. Churchill's letter, which had detailed this very scenario, now took on an eerie resonance as Europe's great powers reacted with shock, confusion, and indecision. In Paris, The French General Staff watched the developments with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. They had the capability to expel the German troops from the demilitarized zone within days, perhaps hours. But their calls for immediate mobilization collided head-on with a government terrified of domestic upheaval. The memory of the Great War weighed heavily on the French psyche. The tens of thousands lost in the trenches, the social fragmentation that followed, the still raw scars of industrial ruin. The political cost of risking another war, no matter how justified, seemed too high for leaders already standing on precarious ground. The French cabinet met in emergency session, but the debates dragged on as ministers argued over whether to act militarily, issue diplomatic protests, or wait for Britain to take a firm position. Churchill's warning had specifically noted that France must not hesitate. That delay would embolden Hitler and shift the strategic balance in Germany's favor. And yet hesitation was precisely what unfolded. While soldiers in Paris remained in their barracks, Hitler's forces planted flags, fortified positions, and celebrated the moment as a national triumph. Across the Channel, Britain responded with caution verging on disbelief. Many in the British government viewed the Rhineland as Germany reclaiming what was geographically and ethnically its own, despite the treaty restrictions. They feared that confronting Hitler over what seemed, on the surface, a limited territorial move would push Europe toward an unwanted conflict. Churchill watched this reaction with mounting frustration, knowing that such reasoning ignored the deeper implications. This was not about land, but about the collapse of a legal framework that had kept Europe's fragile peace intact since 1919. Hitler, emboldened by the lack of resistance, recognized instantly that he had achieved far more than a strategic repositioning. He had exposed the hollowness of European unity. He had revealed that France would not act without Britain, and that Britain lacked the political appetite for confrontation. The gamble had succeeded beyond his most optimistic expectations. German propaganda immediately capitalized on the victory, amplifying Hitler's image as a leader who could defy the great powers without consequence. For Churchill, the moment was devastating not because his warnings had been proven right, but because they had been ignored until the consequences were irreversible. European leaders had received his letter months earlier, explicit, documented, and prophetic. Now, faced with the exact scenario he had described, they found themselves paralyzed, unable to transform recognition into action. Every hour that passed without resistance allowed Germany to consolidate its presence and test the limits of Western resolve. The Rhineland became more than a symbolic victory. It shifted the strategic balance dramatically. France's ability to project power across its eastern frontier weakened, while Germany gained direct access to fortifiable positions that would later serve as staging grounds for further expansion. The reoccupation also boosted German morale, solidified Hitler's political control, and silenced internal critics who had warned him that the gamble might backfire. Churchill, observing this transformation, understood that Europe had crossed a threshold from which retreat would be difficult. Churchill's private correspondence, once merely controversial, now seemed like evidence of a profound diplomatic failure. Those who had dismissed his warnings as alarmist found themselves grappling with a new reality. Germany had taken its first major step toward territorial revisionism, and the Western democracies had failed to act. In the aftermath, the letter remained hidden, spoken of only in cautious whispers among those who recognized how different the outcome might have been had leaders responded with the courage Churchill had pleaded for. The crisis he had desperately tried to prevent had now become the foundation of something far more dangerous, and Europe was sleepwalking deeper into a storm it no longer had the will to stop. In the days after Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, Whitehall was consumed by a tense, uneasy silence. Ministers who had dismissed Churchill's warnings now found themselves grappling with the consequences of inaction. Yet few were willing to acknowledge, even privately, that Churchill's private letter had predicted the crisis with near-perfect accuracy. Admitting such a truth would expose not only a failure of intelligence assessment, but a failure of political will. Instead, Churchill's warnings circulated like a ghost, palpable, undeniable, but never spoken of aloud in official corridors. Inside the Foreign Office, officials pored over diplomatic cables from embassies across Europe. Reports described panic in Belgium, quiet desperation in the Netherlands, and confusion in Paris. Churchill's intelligence summaries, once considered exaggerated, now aligned with the unfolding reality. German units were fortifying their new positions and establishing logistical networks that signaled long-term occupation. What had been a sudden gamble was rapidly becoming a permanent strategic shift. British diplomats, accustomed to measured responses and careful negotiation, suddenly felt as though the ground had moved beneath them. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin faced a moment of internal crisis. Publicly, he maintained that Britain would not rush into conflict over what many perceived as Germany walking into its own backyard. Privately, he recognized the disastrous implications of this stance. Hitler had not merely reclaimed land. He had shattered a treaty Britain had helped craft. Baldwin's advisors urged caution, fearing war more than treaty violations, and the government clung to the belief that Germany could still be moderated through diplomacy. In this environment, Churchill's letter became an inconvenient relic of an argument no one wished to revisit. Churchill, meanwhile, was inundated with messages from contacts across Europe, some congratulatory for his foresight, others panicked, seeking his guidance on what might come next. Though excluded from the cabinet, he had become an unofficial point of counsel for those who sensed the old strategies were crumbling. He continued gathering intelligence, refining his understanding of German military production, and preparing speeches intended to jolt Britain from its complacency. Yet he also knew his access to authority remained severely limited. For all his insight, he was a man speaking from the margins. As debates in Parliament intensified, a deep divide emerged between those who believed Hitler's actions were dangerous precursors to wider aggression and those who believed accommodation was the only path to peace. Churchill's letter, still known only to a select few, became a quiet litmus test. Those who took it seriously aligned themselves with a more assertive approach to German policy, while those who dismissed it championed continued conciliation. The divide was not simply strategic. It reflected fundamentally different understandings of Hitler's worldview, intentions, and capacity for risk. Internationally, Britain's passive stance sent a powerful message. France, already politically fractured, concluded that it could no longer rely on British support for decisive action. Belgian officials, interpreting British inaction as a sign that treaty commitments were weakening, began reconsidering their diplomatic posture. Even smaller states, like Czechoslovakia and Austria, sensed a shift. Germany was testing the limits of the Western democracies, and those limits appeared alarmingly flexible. Churchill's letter had warned that the Rhineland was a pivot point, and now, Europe was tilting in a direction few were prepared to confront. The British press, initially cautious, began to publish editorials expressing concern about the broader implications of German rearmament. Some journalists, having heard whispers about Churchill's private warnings, sought to uncover details of the letter. But government officials discreetly discouraged inquiries, insisting that any such correspondence was merely the work of a private individual with no authority to speak for the nation. Keeping Churchill's letter in the shadows was essential to maintaining the illusion that Britain's policy of appeasement remained prudent and grounded in accurate assessment. And yet, the letter's impact was undeniable. It had shaken confidence in appeasement for those who had seen it. It had forced conversations in foreign ministries that might otherwise have remained unspoken. And most importantly, it had revealed a truth Britain was still reluctant to face. Hitler's strategic ambitions were not limited to symbolic gestures. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was only the first step in a far larger vision. Churchill's private warning, ignored, denied, and concealed, was now a roadmap of a crisis still unfolding, with Britain standing unprepared at the edge of a widening storm. In the months following the Rhineland crisis, Britain's intelligence services began assembling a clearer, more alarming picture of Germany's rapid militarization. Reports from MI6, intercepted communications, and accounts from informants inside German industry revealed a nation rearming at full industrial capacity. Steel production had soared, aircraft factories were operating around the clock, and new armored divisions were being tested on secluded training grounds. The scale of rearmament confirmed what Churchill's letter had warned. Germany was not preparing for defense, it was preparing for domination. Yet these findings confronted a political environment deeply resistant to confrontation. Many British officials, still scarred by the trauma of the Great War, clung to the belief that negotiations, disarmament conferences, and diplomatic assurances could restrain Hitler. They viewed intelligence warnings as exaggerated interpretations designed to stoke fear. As a result, much of the German threat analysis was diluted before it reached the highest levels of government, transformed into cautious assessments rather than urgent alarms. Churchill, who saw early versions of these reports through back-channel contacts, understood that bureaucracy was blunting the very information needed to avert disaster. As intelligence grew more conclusive, the dissonance between Britain's official policy and German military reality became increasingly stark. Analysts within the Air Ministry produced detailed projections showing that the Luftwaffe's expansion threatened to overtake Britain's own air power within a few years. Naval intelligence pointed to rapid German advances in submarine design, hinting at a future conflict in which U-boats could once again choke Britain's lifelines across the Atlantic. Churchill incorporated these revelations into speeches and memos, hoping to force a national reckoning. But his critics dismissed him as a warmonger, accusing him of seeking political advantage by peddling fear. Internationally, Churchill's warnings found a more receptive audience. Scandinavian diplomats, alarmed by reports of German naval construction, reached out to him for insight. Figures within the Polish military studied his assessments carefully, recognizing that Germany's rearmament posed an existential threat to their own security. Even some German officials, quietly disillusioned with Hitler's aggressive policies, attempted to leak information to Churchill through intermediaries. They believed he was one of the few European leaders capable of understanding the true trajectory of the Reich's ambitions. Despite these clandestine transmissions, the British government moved slowly. The Treasury resisted major military spending increases, wary of straining a fragile economy. The RAF struggled to modernize. The British Army remained small, and naval expansion lagged behind Germany's revitalized U-boat program. Britain's strategic posture was caught between outdated assumptions and an unrecognized emergency. Churchill warned repeatedly that time was a diminishing resource, but the government still believed it had years, perhaps decades, to strengthen its defenses. The intelligence community, frustrated by political inertia, began seeking alternative channels to ensure their assessments were heard. Some analysts discreetly shared their findings with Churchill, trusting him to voice truths that ministers preferred to ignore. Others placed more emphasis on corroborating evidence, working tirelessly to produce reports so detailed they could not be easily dismissed. Gradually, a shadow network emerged, unofficial, informal, but driven by a shared conviction that traditional political processes were failing in the face of an unprecedented threat. By late 1936, the intelligence story had become undeniable. Germany was building an air force capable of striking London, an army capable of overrunning neighbors, and a navy capable of reviving unrestricted warfare. Churchill recognized that each month of inaction brought Britain closer to a strategic tipping point from which recovery would be impossible. He viewed intelligence not merely as information but as a moral warning, a call to action for a nation still lulled by illusions of peace. The letter he had sent earlier in the year now cast a long shadow over these developments. Those who had read it saw its predictions unfolding point by point. Those who had ignored it felt an unspoken pressure mounting around them. And Churchill himself, armed with more intelligence than ever before, understood that Britain was drifting into a perilous void between knowledge and action. The storm he had foreseen was no longer distant. It was forming rapidly, gathering strength, and Britain remained frighteningly unaware of how little time it had left to prepare. The mounting tension across Europe that winter pressed itself into the very air of London, settling in the city like a heavy fog no wind could lift. Within government ministries, conversations grew shorter, eyes more watchful, and tempers more easily frayed. Intelligence briefings reported German industrial output rising at a pace that suggested not preparation but urgency, an unmistakable acceleration of rearmament. Churchill, combing through reports late into the night, sensed the rhythm of a power gathering itself for a decisive leap. Each statistic, each decoded message, each railway shipment traced across the Reich, formed a mosaic that the government still refused to see. Yet he could not ignore what the pattern revealed. Hitler was moving faster than European diplomacy could ever hope to catch. This deepening conviction made Churchill increasingly vocal, both inside Parliament and in private letters to influential figures. These letters were blunt, urgent, sometimes almost desperate in tone, not out of panic, but out of a man's unyielding determination to drag the political establishment into reality before it was too late. In one of these messages, circulated quietly among senior conservatives, he warned that Germany was on the verge of possessing an air force capable of striking London in a single devastating blow. His phrasing was meticulous, chosen for impact but grounded in data he had examined line by line. Those who received the letter debated whether he was exaggerating for effect, failing to understand that he had actually understated the danger for the sake of credibility. Outside the corridors of power, Churchill observed an unsettling cultural divide forming, one between those who wanted to believe peace could be maintained through diplomatic patience, and those who believed Hitler's ambitions made such patience fatal. Newspapers continued to print cautiously optimistic headlines, praising efforts to maintain continental harmony. Editorials described Churchill's warnings as relics of an older, more bellicose era. Many readers chose comfort over vigilance, hoping that the unease creeping across Europe was merely another political storm that would dissipate with time. Yet Churchill sensed that the calm was artificial, masked by wishful thinking and the world's desire to avoid considering the cost of another global war. Each new German provocation, however small on the surface, magnified Churchill's sense of imminent danger. The reoccupation of the Rhineland, earlier dismissed by much of Europe as a localized German matter, now appeared to him as the first unmistakable signal that Hitler was probing Allied limits, calculating their thresholds of resistance. The lack of any firm response had emboldened the Nazi leadership, setting a precedent that Churchill feared would cascade into even bolder territorial demands. In this context, he saw every subsequent diplomatic concession not as a step toward stability, but as a step toward the strategic encirclement of the continent. Behind closed doors, Churchill's frustration reached a quiet, simmering intensity. He wondered how many more warnings needed to go unheeded before Britain's leaders realized the truth. His private notes from this period reveal a man who felt both weary and resolute, exhausted by the effort of continually pressing a case few wanted to hear, yet anchored by a conviction that silence would be the greater betrayal. He confided to a close friend that he felt like a voice shouting across a chasm, uncertain whether the far side wished to hear him or simply hoped the echo would fade on its own. It was during this period of escalating tension that Churchill began refining not only his warnings, but also his strategic vision for what Britain would need to do if Hitler continued unchecked. He pored over military readiness reports, aircraft production numbers, naval tonnage, and manpower estimates, crafting an informal blueprint for national survival long before the government accepted that such planning might be necessary. This intellectual labor became his private counterweight to the despair that might otherwise have overwhelmed him. If the nation would not yet prepare openly, then Churchill would prepare mentally, refusing to allow Britain to enter a crisis blind. As European diplomacy staggered forward, stumbling between optimism and denial, Churchill noticed that smaller nations had begun to treat him as a kind of unofficial barometer of British will. Envoys from Eastern Europe, quietly aware of their precarious position between Germany and the Soviet Union, sought informal conversations with him, off the record, behind closed doors, protected from political scrutiny. They asked what he truly believed Britain would do when the next crisis came. Churchill's answers were carefully measured. He could not promise what his government refused to commit, but he could promise what history demanded. His candor made him a rare source of clarity in a landscape clouded by hedged diplomacy. Yet it was in moments of solitude, late at night, study lamp burning low, ashtray filled with the remnants of another cigar, that Churchill felt the full weight of the danger pressing toward Europe. These hours brought him closest to the truth that he sensed but could not yet prove, that Hitler's ambitions were not merely opportunistic, but apocalyptic in scale. The world was sleepwalking toward catastrophe, and he, almost alone, was refusing to close his eyes. This isolation sharpened his resolve. If Britain would not yet see, then he would continue speaking until sight returned, no matter how many dismissed him, laughed at him, or accused him of clinging to a bygone era. He understood the cost of warnings ignored, but he also understood the greater cost of warnings left unspoken. The weeks following the circulation of Churchill's letter revealed a Europe teetering on fragile fault lines. The Rhineland's remilitarization had shattered illusions of stability, yet the continent's leaders clung desperately to the belief that appeasement could contain Hitler. Churchill, watching from London, understood that the failure to act decisively now would embolden the Reich and leave the Western powers strategically paralyzed. The letter, though secret, had begun rippling through intelligence circles, prompting urgent but muted consultations between Britain, France, and smaller nations at risk. Every conversation underscored a single, terrifying truth: time was no longer a friend. In Paris, the political fault lines widened. Senior military officers, aware of the strategic implications of the Rhineland, pressed for mobilization and a clear show of force. Civilian ministers, however, feared domestic unrest and the political backlash of confronting Germany. They calculated that any unilateral action might provoke war, yet hesitation would only invite future aggression. Churchill's letter, which had predicted this exact paralysis months earlier, became a quiet touchstone for those willing to challenge the consensus. Its detailed assessments of German troop movements and industrial capabilities lent weight to arguments that would otherwise be dismissed as alarmist. Smaller European nations, long reliant on treaties and the balance of power, faced the unnerving realization that they could no longer depend on collective security. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia monitored Germany with mounting concern, recognizing that their sovereignty might be next on Hitler's list. Churchill's warnings, already circulating through diplomatic channels, became a critical source of clarity. Envoys and intelligence officers secretly consulted with him, seeking advice and guidance, aware that his insight was unmatched by the slow-moving machinery of official policy. In Berlin, Hitler and his generals followed developments with keen interest. They understood the importance of psychological warfare. The Rhineland's remilitarization was not merely a strategic move, but a test of Allied nerve. German officers noted that France's inaction and Britain's hesitation were more powerful weapons than any artillery or tank division. Churchill's letter, had it been discovered by German intelligence, represented the one voice capable of rallying a coherent, informed response. Its secrecy ensured that Hitler's gamble continued unchecked, reinforcing his belief that Europe could be manipulated through a combination of audacity and timing. Within London, the letter fueled a growing schism between politicians committed to appeasement and those increasingly aware of the threat posed by Hitler. Churchill's voice, though still unofficial, became the focal point for strategic discussion outside cabinet channels. Officers, diplomats, and sympathetic parliamentarians discreetly referenced his assessments, comparing them with internal intelligence reports. The result was a shadow dialogue, a network of informed individuals, separate from official policy, quietly preparing for contingencies that Britain might soon be forced to confront. Despite the growing urgency, inertia dominated public discourse. Newspapers were cautious in their reporting, emphasizing diplomacy and negotiation while downplaying the alarming intelligence emerging from Europe. The general public, still haunted by the memories of World War I, preferred comfort over confrontation, reassurance over clarity. Churchill, acutely aware of this divide, began to plan his next public interventions, recognizing that history would demand courage not just from leaders, but from an entire nation willing to face uncomfortable truths. The strategic implications of Hitler's Rhineland maneuver were profound. By fortifying the region, Germany had gained both a psychological and military advantage. The Western powers' hesitation signaled to the Reich that calculated risk-taking could succeed without immediate repercussion. Each passing week reinforced Churchill's warnings. A failure to act decisively now would leave Europe vulnerable to a domino effect of aggression. His letter, prophetic in both tone and content, had been ignored, and the consequences were rapidly solidifying into strategic reality. As March gave way to April, the sense of urgency in Churchill's private correspondence intensified. He documented every new German deployment, every propaganda broadcast, and every diplomatic nuance that hinted at Hitler's expanding ambitions. The letter, initially a solitary act of foresight, had become a living reference point for a Europe struggling to understand the true scale of the threat. In its quiet, powerful way, it underscored a chilling conclusion. The failure to act when warned would exact a cost far greater than anyone yet imagined, and Britain might soon be forced to stand alone against an enemy that had already seized the initiative. By mid-1936, the true weight of Britain's strategic isolation began to press heavily upon Churchill. The Rhineland crisis had demonstrated that the Western powers could not rely on each other to act decisively. France remained politically paralyzed, its internal divisions preventing any meaningful show of force. Smaller nations, while grateful for intelligence insights, could offer little beyond moral support. Britain, though geographically insulated by the Channel, faced the growing realization that Hitler's next moves could reshape Europe before any formal alliance could be mobilized. Churchill's letter, now a privately referenced blueprint of the crisis, underscored the urgency of Britain preparing independently, even if it meant standing alone. Within Whitehall, debates raged over the appropriate response. Senior military leaders advised that Britain needed to bolster its defenses immediately, particularly in terms of air power and coastal fortifications. The Air Ministry emphasized the threat of German bombers, warning that a repeat of past underestimations could prove catastrophic. Yet political leadership hesitated, constrained by economic concerns, public complacency, and lingering memories of the human and financial costs of the Great War. Churchill understood that this hesitation was not born of ignorance, but of fear, and he recognized that fear could be as lethal as any foreign army. Churchill's private correspondence during this period reveals a man grappling with profound frustration. He urged ministers to consider worst-case scenarios, meticulously detailing the consequences of inaction. He highlighted Germany's capacity for rapid military production, the effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics already being conceptualized, and the potential collapse of European treaties. To Churchill, the danger was no longer abstract. Hitler was systematically eroding the pillars of continental security, and Britain's failure to act decisively might render future resistance futile. Beyond the government, Churchill began to cultivate a network of supporters who could act as conduits for his warnings. Influential journalists, sympathetic parliamentarians, and key figures in the intelligence community became his informal allies. Through private meetings and confidential letters, he ensured that the reality of German ambitions, documented with precision in his secret letter, was shared with those capable of influencing opinion, even if the broader government remained hesitant. These efforts laid the groundwork for a future coalition of preparedness that would become essential when war inevitably arrived. In Berlin, Hitler's observation of Britain's inaction reinforced his strategic confidence. German planners noted that the Channel remained a formidable barrier, but the lack of coordinated response to the Rhineland emboldened them to continue testing the limits of European resolve. Propaganda emphasized German strength and Western weakness, shaping domestic opinion to support further aggression. For Hitler, Churchill was a peculiar figure, an adversary whose insight was remarkable but whose immediate influence seemed limited. Nonetheless, the letter's contents, if ever exposed, could serve as a roadmap for opposition, and this potential weighed on German strategic planners in quiet, speculative conversations. Meanwhile, the wider European public remained largely unaware of the underlying danger. Newspapers and periodicals emphasized diplomatic niceties, economic concerns, and political posturing, carefully avoiding the hard truths that Churchill's letter contained. Public perception of Hitler as merely a bold nationalist, rather than a calculated aggressor, remained the dominant narrative. Churchill, recognizing the gap between perception and reality, understood that both the public and the government would require repeated, relentless warnings to awaken to the scale of the threat. The strategic calculus facing Britain grew more acute with each passing week. If Hitler succeeded in consolidating his gains in the Rhineland, he would not only control critical industrial regions, but also secure the psychological advantage of momentum. Future German expansion into Austria, Czechoslovakia, or Poland would be facilitated by the precedent of Western inaction. Churchill's secret letter, once a bold plea for awareness, now read like a prescient account of Europe's strategic unraveling, underscoring the heavy burden of foresight in the face of collective hesitation. By late 1936, Churchill's sense of urgency had reached a near-constant intensity. His warnings, his letters, and his private counsel painted a vision of a Europe slipping toward crisis, a Britain unprepared, and a Hitler emboldened. The Rhineland had proven the consequences of inaction. The letter he had written months earlier had already been ignored, and yet the pattern it described was unfolding with precision. For Churchill, the message was clear. Unless Britain prepared decisively, alone if necessary, the continent would soon confront a threat of unparalleled magnitude, and the cost of delay would be measured in both nations and lives. As the European crisis deepened, Churchill began to appreciate that the battle for Britain's preparedness was as much psychological as it was strategic. The hesitation in Paris, the muted response from London, and the reluctance of smaller states to act revealed a profound human vulnerability, the instinct to cling to comfort in the face of an uncomfortable truth. Churchill's secret letter, while meticulously detailed and backed by intelligence, confronted leaders and the public alike with a stark reality they preferred to avoid. It was a message that demanded courage, foresight, and moral clarity, qualities in short supply amid political fatigue and post-war trauma. In London, ministers wrestled with the cognitive dissonance the letter had created. To acknowledge its warnings fully would require confronting decades of appeasement, decades of hope that treaties alone could restrain aggression. To ignore it, however, risked emboldening Hitler and leaving Britain strategically isolated. This tension infiltrated every decision, from military budgeting to public statements, leaving Churchill increasingly frustrated. He recognized that the greatest threat was not German tanks or bombers, but the slow erosion of will, the quiet, cumulative failure to act when reason demanded it. Churchill also understood the personal toll that foresight exacted. Those who perceive danger long before it arrives are often marginalized, criticized, or dismissed as alarmists. Friends and allies whispered that his insistence was excessive, that his predictions were too grim for the public mood. Yet Churchill's experience had taught him that truth, no matter how inconvenient, is rarely comforting. His writings from this period reveal a man balancing frustration, moral urgency, and the necessity of strategic patience, acutely aware that Britain's survival might hinge on a clarity that few were prepared to accept. Across Europe, smaller nations experienced similar struggles. Belgium, the Netherlands, and the Scandinavian countries understood the implications of Churchill's warnings, yet their capacity to respond was constrained by geography, political alliances, and fear of immediate reprisal. Governments attempted to reconcile the letter's urgency with a desire to maintain peace, but every day that passed without coordinated action increased the peril they faced. Churchill's prescient words had illuminated the path, but the steps forward remained fraught, uncertain, and politically dangerous. In Germany, the human dimension played out differently. Hitler's confidence was amplified not only by military success, but by the psychological weakness of his neighbors. German leadership recognized that fear, hesitation, and indecision could be weaponized as effectively as troops or artillery. The Rhineland had shown that Western powers could be manipulated without firing a single shot. Churchill's letter, had it been exposed to Berlin's planners, might have altered the calculus, but secrecy ensured that the psychological advantage remained firmly with the Reich. Churchill's interactions with sympathetic allies revealed another aspect of the human struggle, the quiet courage required to confront authority. Military officers, diplomats, and intelligence officers who shared his concerns risked professional ostracism by acknowledging the letter's warnings. Together, they formed a fragile network of foresight, understanding that survival might depend on their ability to act in the shadows of official policy. The letter became a moral touchstone, a private manifesto for vigilance in an era when public acknowledgement of danger was politically fraught. The personal weight of the crisis was amplified by the looming specter of war. Churchill wrote late into the night, reviewing intelligence reports, drafting speeches, and recording observations. Each page reflected both meticulous calculation and moral urgency. He understood that history would judge leaders not by their optimism or rhetoric, but by their preparedness to act decisively in the face of looming catastrophe. The letter he had sent months earlier was no longer a private warning. It had become an ethical measure of Europe's willingness to confront truth. By the end of 1936, The human element of the crisis had crystallized. Fear, denial, hesitation, and courage existed in a delicate and dangerous balance. Churchill's letter, prophetic in both content and tone, had ignited discussions that could not be fully contained. It exposed both the moral and strategic vulnerabilities of Britain and its neighbors. And though its circulation remained secret, its impact was palpable. Europe was standing at the edge of a precipice, and Britain's choices, informed by foresight or clouded by fear, would determine whether it could face the storm alone or be swept aside entirely. By the winter of 1936, Britain's official stance of cautious appeasement had begun to reveal its fragility. Leaders clung to the belief that negotiation and delay could prevent war, yet intelligence, reinforced by Churchill's private letter, painted a dramatically different reality. Hitler was no longer content with symbolic gains. He was systematically testing the limits of Allied resolve, probing weaknesses, and consolidating power in ways that threatened the continent's balance. The very act of inaction had become a strategic miscalculation with consequences that would reverberate far beyond the Rhineland. Churchill observed the unfolding paralysis with increasing frustration. He understood that appeasement was not merely a policy choice, but a psychological crutch, allowing Britain and its allies to postpone confronting truths too uncomfortable to face. Ministers argued that Germany's moves were defensible, that Europe's stability required patience, and that any provocation might trigger an unwanted conflict. Yet in every detail of the intelligence he received, from troop movements to industrial production, Churchill saw evidence that delay was not neutral, it was dangerous. The letter he had circulated privately had explicitly warned that hesitation would invite audacity, and now history was proving him right. Across the Channel, French leaders wrestled with similar dilemmas. Military planners knew the Rhineland had shifted the strategic balance, yet political concerns dominated decision-making. Mobilization, even limited, risked sparking domestic unrest in a nation still recovering from the trauma of the Great War. Public opinion, carefully molded by years of pacifist sentiment, rejected aggressive posturing, leaving generals frustrated and diplomats constrained. Churchill's letter, cited quietly among these circles, confirmed the grim reality but could not alter the political calculus that prioritized stability over readiness. The smaller states of Europe were increasingly aware of the implications. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg understood that their neutrality might not be respected if Germany chose to expand further. Czechoslovakia and Poland, meanwhile, began reassessing alliances and contingency plans, quietly consulting with Britain through informal channels. Churchill's insight, shared cautiously, became a critical guidepost for these nations, an acknowledgement that Britain's hesitance could not be relied upon as a guarantee of protection. Each country faced the unnerving realization that preparation might require action independent of promises from larger powers. Within Britain, the letter had begun to shape private discourse among military officials, parliamentarians, and journalists. These circles, operating discreetly, understood that the conventional political process could not respond with the speed or decisiveness the situation demanded. Strategic foresight became a silent currency. Reports were circulated, scenarios debated, and warnings discreetly amplified. Churchill's voice, initially marginalized, emerged as a nexus of clarity in a government reluctant to confront the rapidly changing threat landscape. Hitler, observing the Western powers, capitalized on their indecision. The Rhineland operation had been both a military and psychological gamble. The lack of confrontation emboldened his leadership, reinforcing the belief that Europe could be manipulated without risk. German propaganda celebrated strength, unity, and decisiveness, contrasting these virtues with Allied hesitation. The Reich's domestic narrative fed directly into strategic calculations, creating a feedback loop in which inaction abroad directly enabled expansion at home. Churchill understood this dynamic acutely, recognizing that psychological advantage was as decisive as tanks or artillery. By early 1937, Churchill's correspondence and private memos conveyed an unyielding urgency. He meticulously documented German advances, the vulnerability of European defenses, and the failure of appeasement to deter aggression. Every statistic and observation reinforced the argument that Britain could not rely on the hesitations of others. The letter, once a private warning, had become an intellectual and moral anchor, a detailed blueprint for understanding the stakes and preparing for the inevitable confrontation that political caution sought to avoid. Ultimately, the calculus of appeasement revealed its fatal flaw. By prioritizing the avoidance of immediate conflict over recognition of strategic reality, Europe allowed a rising power to accumulate momentum unchecked. Churchill's letter, nearly forgotten by some, yet quietly circulating among the informed, captured the essence of this danger. It warned that hesitation was not neutrality, that diplomacy without resolve was a trap, and that the cost of delay would only compound as Germany solidified its advantage. In the shadow of this misjudgment, Britain's path forward was becoming increasingly clear. Preparation could no longer wait, and the possibility of standing alone loomed ever closer. By the spring of 1937, Churchill recognized that Britain's survival might depend on its capacity to act independently. The Rhineland crisis had proven that reliance on allies was a dangerous illusion, and Hitler's calculated audacity left little room for hesitation. While official policy remained rooted in appeasement, Churchill quietly advised military and political allies on the steps necessary to fortify the nation. His private letters, brimming with intelligence analysis, production estimates, and tactical recommendations, became the backbone of an informal strategic effort, a preparation that operated in the shadows of government, anticipating the day when the warnings he had issued could no longer be ignored. The emphasis was on speed and pragmatism. Churchill highlighted the need to modernize the Royal Air Force, expand the Navy's defensive capabilities, and develop rapid response strategies for potential invasions. Each recommendation was grounded in intelligence gathered from Germany's industrial centers, troop movements, and logistical patterns. He knew that the Germans were not merely rearming. They were constructing the tools of offensive war. To Churchill, every delay in strengthening Britain's defenses was a gift to Hitler, every moment of inaction a potential invitation to catastrophe. Beyond material preparations, Churchill also focused on cultivating political will. He used private correspondence, strategic briefings, and careful engagement with sympathetic parliamentarians to create a network of influence capable of shifting public and governmental perception when the time came. These efforts were deliberate and cautious, reflecting both the urgency of the threat and the constraints of political reality. The secret letter he had sent months earlier now served as both justification and roadmap, a touchstone for those seeking clarity amid uncertainty. Intelligence continued to refine the picture of Germany's capabilities. Reports of new aircraft models, armored divisions, and logistical improvements confirmed that Hitler's strategy was long-term and highly coordinated. German planners had internalized the lesson of the Rhineland. Boldness combined with timing could achieve objectives without immediate confrontation. Churchill used these insights to construct detailed assessments of risk, illustrating not only the potential for attack, but the catastrophic consequences of being caught unprepared. The letter, now effectively prophetic, had transformed from warning to blueprint. The human dimension of this silent mobilization was equally significant. Officers and diplomats who aligned with Churchill understood the personal risks of acting outside official channels. Many faced professional censure, social isolation, and political backlash. Yet they were motivated by a shared recognition that the survival of Britain, and, potentially, of Europe, depended on foresight, courage, and the willingness to act in the absence of formal authority. Churchill's letter had crystallized the stakes, providing moral clarity to a network operating in the shadows. Across the Channel, Hitler observed Britain's hesitancy with increasing confidence. German intelligence was aware of some of the informal preparations, though they underestimated the depth of Churchill's influence. To the Reich, Britain's apparent reluctance was evidence that European nations were unprepared for decisive action. The psychological edge lay firmly with Germany, reinforcing its leaders' belief in the efficacy of calculated risk. Churchill's insight, although contained in private letters and whispered consultations, remained one of the few barriers to complacency, a quiet, potent force in a continent increasingly lulled by appearances of stability. Churchill's correspondence during this period also revealed a growing awareness of timing as a strategic factor. The longer Europe waited to act, the more difficult intervention would become. Germany's rearmament was not static. Its capacity to project power would soon surpass the defensive reach of Britain and its allies. Churchill's letters emphasized that early, decisive preparation could prevent catastrophe, whereas delay would amplify risk and leave Britain standing alone against an emboldened aggressor. Each word, each analysis, was meticulously constructed to convey both urgency and actionable guidance. By the end of 1937, the contours of Britain's silent mobilization were largely defined. Though hidden from public view and often disregarded by official channels, Churchill's efforts had created a foundation for eventual national readiness. The secret letter, the intelligence analyses, the private consultations, all formed an intricate web of foresight. In essence, Churchill was preparing not only for the military confrontation that would inevitably come, but for the moral challenge of convincing a nation to confront the reality it had long preferred to ignore. Europe's storm was approaching, and Britain's ability to stand alone would depend on the quiet, persistent work of those who had listened when few others would. By late 1937, London existed in a state of uneasy equilibrium. Public life continued with ordinary rhythms, yet behind the polished facades of Whitehall, an undercurrent of tension ran deep. Churchill's secret letter had left an indelible mark on a select group of officials, officers, and diplomats who recognized the enormity of the German threat. The document, once dismissed as alarmist, was now quietly cited as a critical reference in strategic discussions. Yet the broader government, bound by tradition, political caution, and fear of provoking conflict, maintained a veneer of optimism that was increasingly at odds with the intelligence gathered from Berlin. Churchill's efforts to influence policy had evolved from mere warnings to strategic counseling. He advised on logistical expansions, the prioritization of aircraft production, and the fortification of key naval bases. Each recommendation was underpinned by intelligence from multiple sources, from spies embedded in German industrial complexes to diplomatic observers reporting on troop movements and political maneuvers. The urgency in his correspondence was unmistakable. Delay could render even the most robust preparations ineffective, and Britain's strategic autonomy might become its only guarantee of survival. The psychological burden of foresight weighed heavily on Churchill. He understood that the letter had exposed not only Germany's intentions, but the broader vulnerability of European politics to deception, inertia, and misplaced hope. Every new report of German military exercises or propaganda campaigns confirmed that Hitler was deliberately testing the limits of Allied reaction. Churchill's private reflections reveal a man acutely aware that knowledge, without corresponding action, was a source of profound anxiety. The letter, a testament to his prescience, was simultaneously a warning and a responsibility he could not shirk. Across Europe, smaller states grew increasingly apprehensive. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia began recalibrating their contingency plans in quiet coordination with sympathetic British contacts. Poland and Czechoslovakia, though wary of overt alliances, sought intelligence and guidance from Churchill, recognizing that Britain's eventual stance would determine the viability of resistance against German expansion. The letter's influence, though covert, shaped these preparatory efforts, highlighting the intersection of strategy, diplomacy, and moral clarity in the lead-up to broader conflict. Within Germany, Hitler's leadership interpreted the inertia of Britain and France as a validation of audacity. The Rhineland operation had proven that careful, calculated risks could succeed without immediate military reprisal. Propaganda emphasized the contrast between German decisiveness and Allied indecision, consolidating domestic support for further expansion. Churchill, fully aware of the psychological dimension of warfare, noted that the failure to respond robustly to earlier provocations would likely embolden Hitler's future strategy. The letter had foreseen this dynamic, warning that hesitation abroad could be weaponized by an aggressive adversary. Despite the official policy of appeasement, covert networks within Britain continued to expand. Churchill's correspondence with sympathetic military officers and intelligence officials grew more detailed, covering production forecasts, defensive simulations, and potential scenarios of invasion or aerial bombardment. The letter had established a framework for thinking beyond political limitations, guiding preparations that could be mobilized swiftly if the political climate shifted. Each confidential briefing and private memorandum underscored that Britain's capacity to stand alone might soon become a necessity rather than a precaution. The public, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the growing storm. Newspapers focused on diplomatic formalities, economic development, and domestic politics, avoiding the harsh realities outlined in Churchill's letter. The contrast between appearance and reality deepened Churchill's sense of urgency. He understood that public complacency, if unchecked, could delay necessary preparations and reduce the nation's capacity to respond effectively. His private writings from this period reflect the tension between secrecy, moral responsibility, and the need to awaken a nation to truths it was reluctant to confront. By the end of 1937, the European stage was set for the dramatic escalation Churchill had long anticipated. Hitler had demonstrated both capability and audacity. Smaller nations were increasingly anxious, and Britain's public posture remained cautiously optimistic even as private preparations gathered momentum. The secret letter, now recognized as a prophetic and strategic touchstone, had quietly shaped the thinking of those capable of action. It had illuminated the consequences of hesitation and provided a blueprint for survival. Yet the nation's ultimate ability to stand alone remained uncertain, a question that would soon be tested by events only Churchill had foreseen. As 1938 approached, the European landscape bristled with tension, and Britain found itself on the precipice of a historic decision. Churchill's secret letter, months old yet increasingly validated by German actions, had created a quiet but potent undercurrent of awareness among key officials and military strategists. The Rhineland's fortification had emboldened Hitler, and subsequent intelligence confirmed that Germany's expansionist ambitions were deliberate and methodical. For Britain, the question was no longer whether war could be avoided. It was whether the nation could prepare adequately to resist alone if its allies faltered. Churchill's warnings had fostered a clandestine framework of readiness. Military leaders, sympathetic parliamentarians, and intelligence officers worked in concert to anticipate potential German aggression. Airfields were evaluated, aircraft production schedules refined, and naval deployments simulated for rapid response. Even as public discourse continued to favor diplomacy and appeasement, a silent mobilization progressed, reflecting the hard lessons outlined in the secret letter. Every logistical calculation, every scenario planning session, was informed by the knowledge that Britain might soon face an adversary willing to exploit hesitation ruthlessly. Psychologically, the strain on Churchill and his network was immense. Those who foresaw the danger bore the burden of foresight, knowing the stakes while the majority clung to the illusion of stability. Churchill's private writings reveal a man deeply conscious of the moral dimension of preparedness. He understood that leadership required not only knowledge but courage, the courage to act decisively, to speak truth, and to accept the unpopularity that foresight often invites. The secret letter exemplified this principle, articulating both the threat and the responsibility of response. Across Europe, smaller nations watched nervously. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia remained alert, making incremental preparations while hoping for reassurance from Britain and France. Poland and Czechoslovakia recognized that Britain's eventual stance would determine their strategic options. The letter, though not widely known, informed the thinking of diplomats and military planners who understood that the continent's fragile balance could collapse rapidly. Each intelligence report, each strategic consultation, carried the weight of potential catastrophe, reinforcing the sense that the coming months could redefine Europe's future. In Berlin, Hitler's confidence remained unchecked. He had interpreted the Rhineland's occupation as evidence of Allied weakness, and German military planners continued to test limits without fear of immediate reprisal. Propaganda framed Germany as decisive and united, contrasting this narrative with the hesitancy of Western powers. The letter's warnings, had they been intercepted in full, might have prompted a different calculation, but secrecy ensured that Germany remained largely unchallenged. The psychological advantage, meticulously exploited by Hitler, allowed Germany to consolidate power without firing a single shot in open conflict. Within Britain, tension between public policy and private preparation sharpened. Appeasement remained the official doctrine, yet behind the scenes, key figures acted on the insights of Churchill's letter. Military planning intensified, industrial readiness was quietly assessed, and strategic reserves were cataloged for rapid mobilization. The dual reality, a nation publicly committed to peace but privately preparing for war, underscored the precariousness of Britain's position. Churchill understood that when the moment of decision arrived, these preparations could determine whether Britain stood firm or faltered. The moral and strategic urgency of the situation crystallized in Churchill's reflections. He recognized that leadership demanded not only foresight but persistence, the relentless advocacy of truth in the face of denial. The secret letter, initially dismissed, had guided private awareness, shaped contingency planning, and warned that the cost of inaction would be catastrophic. Its foresight, now validated by unfolding events, emphasized the stark reality. Europe's stability rested on the willingness of Britain to confront a threat its leaders had long preferred to ignore. As the first signs of German expansion beyond the Rhineland appeared, Churchill stood at the threshold of historical consequence. Britain, by choice or circumstance, would soon confront the possibility of standing alone against an aggressive and highly prepared adversary. The letter that had nearly sparked a European crisis had accomplished its ultimate purpose. It had forced a select few to see clearly, to prepare diligently, and to understand the stakes of delay. History would remember this period not only for the actions of nations, but for the moral courage of those who foresaw the storm and labored, quietly and persistently, to ensure that Britain could face it and survive.